Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
My name's Ken Warren, and I'm the Deputy Provost for Research and Minority Issues, as well as a professor in our Department of English. And it's with great pleasure that I welcome you today to our symposium on integrating the life of the mind, a symposium associated with the wonderful special exhibit curated by Danielle Allen, which you've seen in the foyer of the Special Collections section. Before beginning, I'd like to, and giving you an overview of the day's events, I'd like to be sure to thank several people without whose work this event couldn't have taken place. Danielle Allen, of course, who can't be here for her work in curating the Integrating the Life of the Mind exhibit. I'd like also to thank Dan Meyer and the staff of the Special Collections for helping us organize and making this space available for today's symposium. And from the Office of Special Events, Joan Bentley Hoffman and Judy Lindsay as well have been crucial in helping today's efforts. And from my office, Kelly Camp and Cheryl Bradley Stone. I'd also like to, and I'll introduce him at greater length shortly, to thank our two out-of-town speakers, Jonathan Holloway and Francille Wilson, for coming out. I think that I've reached a point in my life where I think winter travel ought to be about going from someplace cold to someplace warm. So anytime someone decides in January to come to Chicago, they deserve special thanks. And before beginning, I'd like to make an announcement of an exhibit that you should all be aware of. At the Spertus Museum has an exhibition preview coming up Thursday, February 5th, 5:30 to 8 p.m., called A Force for Change, African American Art and the Julius Rosenwald Fund. Here is the card for this, and there's a wonderful book from the exhibit, so that if you mark your calendars, try to get out for the special event, or certainly see the collection there. As I think is evident from anyone who's taken a look at the exhibit out there, the history of African Americans at the University of Chicago is the history of the University of Chicago. I think it's arguable that, and no, in fact, it's not merely arguable, it's a fact that this institution would not have been the illustrious place that it is without the contributions of African Americans and the long-term and intellectual engagement between the institution and the scholars of African American social history, literature, and the like, and the presence of African Americans in the city of Chicago. As you have seen from the exhibit, this is not simply an occasion for celebration. There are aspects of that history that deserve more in the way of sober reflection. In fact, as many of you know, Ralph Ellison, in a biting review in 1944 of Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, singled out the University of Chicago's Department of Sociology, Robert Park in particular, for for having had a detrimental effect on the political lives of African Americans in this country. And yet, this history is also not merely an occasion for condemnation. I think that the history of the development of crucial disciplines, as we'll see today, it was profoundly affected for good by work that was done here at the University of Chicago. And if the history of the University of Chicago is the history of African Americans at the University of Chicago, it's also clear that the history of the social science disciplines in the United States and in the world, as well as the history of American literature, is part of the history of African Americans at the University of Chicago. Today's symposium will involve several events, and I realized in terms of making my thank yous, I did not single out my sort of co-conspirators, which include Kathy Cohen from the Provost's Office and Department of Political Science, Adam Green from the Department of History, and Wallace Good from the University Community Service Center, who I think are responsible for conceiving the idea for today's event. We will have several sessions starting this morning with presentations by two visiting scholars, Francile Wilson from the University of Southern California and Jonathan Holloway from Yale. After their formal presentations, there'll be an opportunity for discussion from the floor. And then we'll break shortly after that. And at noon, we will have an address from Adam Green in the Department of History. And then from 11 to noon, excuse me. Then there'll be a time for lunch, noon to 1. And then the afternoon will be focused on two roundtable panels, one involving faculty members from the University of Chicago and one involving undergraduate students. So we hope that you can make time for all the events for today. Let me start by introducing our visiting, our morning speakers. Francile Wilson is professor of African American Studies at the University of Southern California, where she's been for not that long now, right? Because she was also a professor at the University of Maryland, where she was in the Department of American Studies and Women's Studies. Her work focuses on intellectual and labor history, and current research examines the intersections between black labor movements, black social scientists, and black women's history during the Jim Crow era. Her book, The Segregated Scholars, Black Social Scientists and the Creation of Black Labor Studies from 1890 to 1950, published by the University of Virginia Press, examines three generations of scholar activists. And she has a biography in progress of the lawyer and economist Sadie T.M. Alexander. Still in progress. You can tell me if I'm behind the curve here. So no, that was published 2 years ago. Sorry. Investigates representations of black women workers and the impact of racism and sexism on black women in male professions in the early 20th century. She's a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians and was the Association of Black Women Historians 2002 luncheon speaker, and then on, but I'll stop there. So why don't I stop with that introduction, and then Francile, you're speaking first, and then I will introduce Professor Holloway. So please join me in welcoming Francile Wilson.
Can you hear me? I usually can have a pretty loud voice. Thank you, Professor Warren. It's always embarrassing for us historians who can take a long time to finish our work to, forthcoming, things keep being forthcoming, but I am still working on the biography of Sadie Alexander. And I also want to thank Kathy Cohen and all the other people that put this panel together. In my talk today, the first cadre, Black Social Science at the University of Chicago before the Great Migration, I want to push back the history of black social science at Chicago to the 1890s. Usually when we think about the Chicago School, we started with Robert Park. But today, my talk will argue that a full dozen years before the Great Migration and the arrival of Park, Charles S. Johnson, and E. Franklin Frazier, a small cadre of black students led by Richard Robert Wright Jr. and Monroe Work extended the methods of W.E.B. Du Bois and the subjects of black social research to the north and became a part of a lively social reform movement. Other black scholars, including the sociologist George Edmund Haynes and historian Carter G. Woodson, also studied at the University of Chicago, and each of them went on to institutionalize access to the academy. They promoted scholarship and reform nationwide and provided prestigious jobs for ambitious black men, including Charles S. Johnson and E. Franklin Frazier before and during the times that they were at the University of Chicago. I've argued in my book, The Segregated Scholars, that black women were as interested in, is that just going on its own? We're going to go back. We'll just start with that picture. As interested in social science as their husbands and brothers, but the experience of black women students at the University of Chicago, from Georgiana Simpson, Elizabeth Ross Haynes, to Myra Colson Callis, illustrate the additional barriers women faced in gaining advanced degrees and jobs inside and outside the academy. Ambitious black students were drawn to the University of Chicago at the turn of the century. R.R. Wright, Jr., a divinity and sociology student from 1898 to 1904, sang the city's praises. No city is more American than Chicago. It is new. There are few cities where a Negro comes nearer to earning what is his due than in Chicago. While the old settlers, longtime residents, black residents, bemoaned the ever-increasing housing segregation and occupational discrimination in the Windy City, Georgia Braun Wright was rendered speechless when the white janitor in his dormitory asked to be called by his first name. He promptly decided never to return to live in the South. A fortuitous confluence of factors caused the University of Chicago, which opened in 1892, to immediately attract black students, most of whom were school teachers and administrators attending during the summer session. Black students easily qualified for and were admitted to the new institution with little fuss, despite founding president William Rainey Harper's distinct lack of enthusiasm for integration. The University of Chicago also allowed students to take correspondence courses, transfer credits, and to partially fulfill its residency degree requirements during summer quarters, something that Harvard and Yale did not do. These practices allowed hundreds of black school teachers who were paid salaries substantially lower than their white counterparts to upgrade their credentials and to pursue bachelor's and master's degrees with minimum interruption of their livelihoods. I hope that some scholar will really look into this. I've been fascinated with learning how many courtships took place at the turn of the century and before the Great Migration between people who were coming here for summer school. And so I'm going to do that, but I think that I did want to mention that literally hundreds of black students studied at Chicago before 1915. 2 decades before the Chicago Defender began urging migrants to come north, black college newspapers regularly reported on, heard from, and praised their alumni who had gone to Chicago for work or study. In 1898, the Athenaeum advised students at Morehouse and Spelman that the University of Chicago was, quote, not a university exclusively of rich men's sons and daughters. The rich and the poor work side by side in the same classrooms, in the same laboratories. No distinctions of rank or color. Blood and brains are the only criteria. Black students at the turn of the century lived and studied in a much more welcoming environment than those who came just a decade later and found they were barred from living in the dormitories, while R.R. Wright, Monroe Work, and Carter G. Woodson had lived in student housing between 1898 and 1908 without serious incidents. Georgiana Simpson, Mordecai Johnson, and John W. Davis were among those living in dormitories in 1907 and 1911 who were forced to leave the dorms. I think it's interesting to understand that women were barred first. Georgiana Simpson was thrown out of the dorm in 1907. I think, as far as I can tell, she was in the dorm the summer of 1906. And this was overturned by the then Dean of Women, Sonia Breckinridge, and overruled by President Harper, who put her out. At the time, Simpson was 41 years old and a high school teacher in Washington, D.C. You'll see out in the exhibit that Georgiana Simpson was the first black woman to get a PhD from Chicago. In fact, the first black woman to get a PhD. So she ended up persevering. Some of you that have seen, and for whatever reason, my picture of Mordecai Johnson just would not copy today. Some of you that have seen pictures of Mordecai Johnson know that it's a deep irony that he was barred, because he clearly could have passed for a white person, but I think that because they knew he was coming from a black college, that he ended up being barred as well. We can go to the next slide. Future sociologists Monroe Nathan Work and Richard Robert Wright Jr. met during the university's 1898 summer session. They found jobs in the university library and were among the 30 or so black students among the summer session's enrollment of 2,000. Both were sons of former slaves and fledgling African Methodist ministers, but their differences reflected the heterogeneous life and educational experiences of the first fully freeborn generation. Born in 1866, Monroe Work narrowly escaped the enslavement that bound his large family in North Carolina. His schooling in Cairo, Illinois, and rural Kansas was episodic, and he was not able to enter high school until he was 23 years old. And that he was very similar to Carter Woodson, who started high school at 20. And didn't begin his undergraduate studies at University of Chicago until age 32. By contrast, 20-year-old R.R. Wright Jr. had perhaps one of the best preparatory high school educations available at the time and had graduated from Georgia State Industrial College, where his well-respected and well-known father, R.R. Wright Sr., was the president. Wright remembered his, if you go to the next slide, remembered that his coming to Chicago would have a symbolic as well as a personal meaning. He recalled, "When I left for Chicago, an old ex-slave said, 'Don't you let those white boys up north beat you at anything.' I felt I represented not only myself and the prestige of Professor Wright's family, but the whole Negro American race." His father was a trustee of Atlanta University and in its so-called first graduating class. I say that because they don't count the normal school, which had women like his Wright Jr.'s own professor, Lucy Laney, as their first graduating class. The very summer that Wright Jr. entered the University of Chicago, his father had engineered the appointment of W.E.B. Du Bois to teach sociology at Atlanta University. When the fall term of 1898 began, the number of black students dropped from 30 to 4. The number of white students also dropped in half. But Wright and Work, can we go to the next slide, were quickly drawn into the activities of Reverend Ransom's institutional church and his Sunday Men's Club, where black students at the University of Chicago and Northwestern met and interacted with black professionals and working class leaders. Ransom was a rising star in the AME Church, who had established the denomination's first urban social ministry, complete with daycare facilities, boys and girls clubs, job training, recreation, and intellectual programs. After the publication of The Souls of Black Folk in 1902, both Wright and Work were tapped by Ransom to help with the intercollegiate banquet at which Du Bois was honored with during a 3-day conference on the status of black people. Wright was the secretary for this event, and Monroe Work was on the arrangements committee. Work's meeting with Du Bois was the start of a lifelong friendship between the two men and a collaboration in which Work soon added his own original studies to Atlanta University and collected data for special census reports that Du Bois had been commissioned to do. The institutional church and other social activities introduced black undergrad and grad students to the exciting reformers in Chicago. While R. Wright Jr. had met many of the Southern black elite in his father's parlor, Work was a working class person and had no entree to this group. The city and their status as university students provided this entree for him that he met. If you go to the next slide, I think John Hope was another person who began to meet people. He was also in the summer session of 1898. And the next slide, I think. And somewhere around there, he met his future wife, Eugenia Burns, who had worked at Hull House. They all met Ida B. Wells and Ferdinand Barnett and Fannie Bear. I think the next slide, that's Reverend E. Ransom. And perhaps the next slide is Fannie Barrier Williams and Ida B. Wells. So this is the milieu that Wright and Work found themselves in. And it made a very important difference in how they began to really be the scholars of the Black North. Now, unlike Du Bois, who was trained at the University of Berlin and Harvard and was rather famously anti-clerical despite his studies of the black church, both R. Wright Jr. and Monroe Work were heavily influenced by Christian sociology and the social gospel movements. And their training mirrored the then close relationships between the faculties of the Divinity School, the Department of Sociology, local settlements. But their publication and research opportunities were more often provided by Du Bois or white progressives who believed in survey research. Monroe Work had started working with Graham Taylor at the Chicago Theological Seminary in 1895. Taylor believed, as did most Christian sociologists, that you should instruct from the ground up and not from the clouds down. And so the work that people did in divinity school at this time, if they were interested in sociology, is sociology and often not divinity. Work's term paper on race and crime for Taylor became the basis of his article published in the American Journal of Sociology in 1900, the first by a black author. He discovered soon, though, that he disliked both the politics and the pulpit of the AME Church, and he entered the University of Chicago in the spring term of 1898 with the express intention of studying sociology. His principal advisor, if we go to the next slide, that's another person who studied in Chicago, not at the University of Chicago, but at this time at Moody Bible College. There's Work. His principal advisor was William I. Thomas. Thomas's rejection of the biological theories of race, his arguments for historical and cultural explanations of group differences, and his insistence that prejudice was the fear of the unknown resonated with Work, who believed in fighting racism and prejudice with facts rather than prayer. He later recalled, quote, "I dedicated my life to the gathering of information, the compiling of exact knowledge concerning the Negro." Work completed his master's degree in sociology in 1903 with a study of black ownership of real estate in Chicago. full of charts and designs like we'd later see in Black Metropolis and other studies. Confident and proud that he was the first black person at Chicago, as well as probably the United States, to earn a master's in sociology. However, he was now 37. He'd spent 8 years in the city, and he didn't want to spend more time, probably 2 more years of residence to earn a PhD. And through Wright Jr., he was able to get hired at Georgia State College for Negroes in Savannah. He immediately founded a Sunday Men's Club and continued to do research and political action, and continued to be in touch with people in Chicago. As many of you know, in 1908, work accepted Booker T. Washington's invitation to establish a Department of Records and Research at Tuskegee Institute, and for the next 30 years he studied lynching, compiled extensive bibliographies on black life, which he thought, quote, would make it possible to answer in a factual manner questions relating to relating to black people, in the belief that, quote, in the end, facts will help eradicate prejudice and misunderstanding. For facts are the truth, and the truth will set us free. Well, we can think about that, but this is the idea of most of the early social scientists, that the truth will make us free, that there's sort of a misunderstanding. Go to the next slide. William Thomas, the next slide. Back to Wright Jr. Wright's experiences were different. He was less likely, he didn't want to choose between theology and sociology, and he worked with, I believe in the next slide, is Sheila Matthews, professor of New Testament history and interpretation, who was his main advisor, and helped him to reconcile the AME Church's fundamentalist views and the then stream of critical biblical analysis that was called the higher criticism. He also took courses with William Rainey Harper, and apparently the two men got along very well. I know that Wright was extremely thin-skinned and sensitive to insults. In fact, when he was at University of Pennsylvania, he had a list of errors that he felt his professors were making, and he reviewed his professors' lectures before class so that they wouldn't be arguing throughout class. So I think it's interesting, given Harper's record of hostility to black people, that Wright really succeeded and loved his courses, his Old Testament courses, his courses in Hebrew. One of the things that Wright wanted to do was to really prove that black people could excel in Latin and Greek and all the things that John C. Calhoun said that black people could not do. And the Wright family was very proud of the fact that they believed that they were of that they were completely African, of complete African descent, and so that his ability to read Hebrew was one of the signs that not just he, but other that black people were equal in intelligence to whites. But while he was there, if we could go to the next slide, he minored in sociology under the direction of departmental chairman Albion Small, and worked with C. Richmond Henderson, who was then a professor of sociology at the Divinity School. his classes with Henderson and careful reading of Du Bois clearly shaped his 1901 undergraduate thesis in divinity, the title of which was The Industrial Condition of Negroes in Chicago. And it was a distinctly non-theological study of black workers at the turn of the century. He then went on to do studies for the U.S. Department of Labor, and Matthews helped him enter the universities of Berlin and Leipzig, where he studied for a year. When he came back to Chicago, he wrote his thesis in divinity on the Gospels, but he found the Department of Sociology and Divinity gripped in turmoil. Henderson left, Albion Small left his connection with the Divinity School, and he also witnessed a bitter and violent labor strike by black Teamsters and began to feel that sociology was his path. The AME Church had also assigned him to a small mission, which was in an area of Chicago that Fannie Barrier Williams had dubbed Darkest Africa. And not just because it had black people, but supposedly because of its vice. Wright's study of 2,500 residents in the physical environment was published to great acclaim, and both black club women and the wives of the meatpacking industrialists Swift and Armour raised funds and volunteers for new programs at the mission, including a day nursery, evening school classes, to help men pass the post office exams. But the congregation stayed poor and small, and Wright himself was obliged to work at the post office to make ends meet and pay for graduate school. When W.E.B. Du Bois advised him of an opportunity to work at a settlement house in Philadelphia, he took that up and ended up becoming the second black person to earn a degree in doctorate in sociology in 1911. The record is silent as to why he didn't stay in Chicago, or if he wanted to stay at the University of Chicago. Let me see how my time is going. I want to briefly mention two other people that were important at the University of Chicago, Carter Woodson and George Edmund Haynes. Woodson used the flexibility of the university to do correspondence courses and earn 2 degrees between 1907 and 1908. He started summer and correspondence courses in 1902. And because of the people he met in Chicago, he returned to Chicago in 1915 to start the Association for the Study of African-American, now African-American Life and History, then Negro Life and History. George Haynes, who would later become the co-founder of the National Urban League, came to Chicago first as a young teenager to see the World's Fair, and returned for 2 summers, probably 1906 and 1907, where he was also courting his future wife, Elizabeth Ross Haynes, during summer school. R.R. Wright also courted his future wife in summer school. Haynes, who ended up getting a PhD in 1912 from Columbia, was much more advanced than the other black students I've talked about. When he came here, he already had a master's in economics and sociology from Yale University, but he wanted to study with James R. Angel, and apparently this really helped him as he went forward. The connection between Haynes and the future Chicago School is that as founding the Urban League and starting its Fellows Program, he started the vehicle that allowed many black social workers that were men to become sociologists. E. Franklin Frazier worked with the Urban League and then later worked at the Atlanta School of Social Work before he came to Chicago and was very familiar with the Urban League program. Most of the black students under Park did their field work at the Urban League, which provided unpaid help for the Urban League and also avoided the possibility of placements in segregated institutions, so it had a two-way street. Park was both the local president of the Urban League and the president for a short time of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. So there were many connections. My time is shorter, so I want to finish by saying that it was much more difficult for women to make these ladders. Most black colleges did not had a path that took women out of the traditional bachelor's degree path. In 1898, there were fewer than 2,500 black people who had bachelor's degrees. There were 25,000 black teachers. So there's 2,500 blacks with college degrees, and only 252 of them, by Du Bois's count, were women. It was doubly hard because women took domestic science instead of math. They were off the science track. So although Elizabeth Ross and George Haynes were equally talented and had been college sweethearts at Fisk, Elizabeth Ross found herself taking undergraduate courses in summer session at Chicago while her sweetheart could take graduate courses. He also got recommended to go directly to Yale for his master's degree, whereas this was going to Yale and Harvard was something that was much more difficult for women at the turn of the century. I mean, not only were they men's schools, but the openings in graduate schools were very limited. So Elizabeth Ross was attempting to do this, but it would take her about 15 years longer to ultimately get a master's degree in sociology, and she never got a PhD. Similarly, Georgiana Simpson, as you'll see outside, took 15 years of study. She had got a normal school degree in 1885, and it took her 15 years of study from about 1906 to 1921 to get her PhD, because she taught during the year, came for summer schools, took correspondence courses. And so the road was much harder. And even when you did get a degree, like later Myra Colson Callis, who was a talented black woman in the 20s that was here in the sociology department, she found it very difficult to get jobs, and about the only person that hired her to do studies was Carter Woodson. And today, when you try to find out things about her, you mainly find out about her husband, who was a founder. And the reason you find out so when you look up, she seems to be more remembered because she married one of the founders of Alpha Phi Alpha, than for her very important social studies on black migrants to Chicago. So there are a number of us that hope that the work that Simpson, Elizabeth Ross Haynes, and Myra Colson Callis could be looked at more seriously, and that we'll be able to understand a little bit more about early history of blacks at the University of Chicago. Thank you.